Next up, we are going to hear from a diverse panel of business leaders who will discuss corporate responsibility trends through the lens of how businesses are connecting the power of purpose with corporate action now. We're fortunate to have a truly amazing group with us, as always, with us today. So let's welcome our Corporate Responsibility Trends panel who are invited to join us now at the panel. Please make your way up to the table. Okay, as they make their way up, I'm honored to introduce our panel moderator, in the black jacket there, Laura Gitman, Senior Vice President of BSR. Laura leads BSR's New York office and serves as a member of its executive committee. In that capacity, she works with global companies across sectors on a range of issues to develop and enhance their sustainability strategies. Joining Laura on the panel is Jonathan Atwood. Jonathan is Vice President of Sustainable Business and Communications at Unilever North America. Jonathan leads Unilever's communications and brand, which includes shaping and developing Unilever's well-known Sustainable Living Plan in North America. Next, Heidi Dubois, sorry about that, is Global Head of Philanthropy and Corporate Social Responsibility at BNY Mellon. In this enterprise-wide role, Heidi works to build and strengthen BNY Mellon's philanthropic and corporate responsibility performance, both internally and externally, on local, regional, national, and global levels. Amanda Gardner, is Vice President of Global Sustainability and Innovation at Pearson plc. There, she directs the integration of social, economic, and environmental issues into Pearson's business strategy, driving profitability while expanding long-term value. Again, details are in your packet. Laura, over to you.
Thank you so much. Before I knock over the table. Well, it is my pleasure to be here again, and thank you for inviting me. I've done this panel a few times, which is a really interesting way to be able to reflect. You know, when you're doing a trends panel, it's sometimes challenging to come up with what's new, and yet every year, I think things are changing so rapidly that there's always a lot of new things to talk about. I've been especially thinking about this over the past couple of months because BSR just celebrated our 10th anniversary in New York, as well as our 25th anniversary overall last fall. And so I've been reflecting a lot on how much has changed in the field of sustainability and corporate responsibility, and how much has not changed, how many of the conversations and issues we're still talking about, and yet how rapid the change has been. And I think that's an interesting frame for our discussion today around, what are the new trends? How do you understand what to focus on when there's so much changing and so much disruption externally? And at the same time, what have been the challenges and why haven't we made more progress on some of these core issues? I think, one of the things that has been really interesting in those reflections has been the fact that we are in a world of tremendous disruption, and so everything is changing. The physical environment is changing, our political environment is changing, the technology is changing, business models are changing, and so we're in a time of incredible disruption, and that means working on corporate responsibility issues for the way business has been run over the past decades doesn't work anymore. You need to really understand and shape your corporate responsibility strategies for where business is going and where the issues will be rather than where they currently are. And that's challenging. I think it's challenging for our panelists to deal with some of the whiplash of constant, what's the new fad, what's the new set of metrics, what's the new reporting expectations, what's the issue of the day, and how do you have a strategy in the midst of all of that change. And so that's a little bit what I want to talk about today. So to get us going, let's start with the macro. Let's start with the external changes. And Amanda, I'm going to start with you. How is the external business and political environment changing in a way that actually impacts your role and in a way that impacts your ability to drive sustainability at Pearson?
Sure. So I work at Pearson. Pearson is a large education company, and we essentially make products and services that are sold across the education spectrum. So preschool, primary school, secondary school, up through university and into professional education. There are a lot of trends that are impacting our business in a big way, and you've already mentioned one of them, technology. People aren't consuming education the way you and I might have consumed education sitting in a classroom. Technology is changing most industries, and education isn't any different. Things are moving to online education. Consumers are demanding online education. They're wanting to learn in different places outside of the classroom, on the move, from their living room couches, and that's really impacting how Pearson is thinking about doing business. And it's also impacting our entire competitive set. Our peers have traditionally been large educational publishers, and that's changing. We're now competing and partnering with the likes of Google, with the likes of Facebook, IBM's, large technology companies who have moved into education. And so this is hugely disruptive for the way Pearson is thinking about business models, but also the way that we're thinking about sustainability, because no longer are we sourcing paper. Well, we do still source paper. In fact, it's still a huge part of our supply chain, but we're moving, as we move to digital, we're having to think about how do we think about our environmental impacts if we're on devices, for example, and no longer using textbooks. We're having to think about what kind of content do we need to develop for a digital world and for a digital learner who's going to have to think about being sustainable in their everyday practices going forward. So there's a huge amount of disruption just happening from technology that impacts my job. There's a million other trends I could talk about, but I'll leave the others.
Great. Heidi, what about you?
Sure. So I'm Heidi DuBois, and as Claire said, I head up philanthropy and CSR at BNY Mellon, which is actually the 7th largest asset manager in the world. We also are a large custodial bank on the investment services side of our business. So I think technology is an undercurrent to probably a lot of things we'll talk about today, but people think of us as the information or financial superhighway for the global financial system, and that comes with a tremendous amount of responsibility for the stability of global markets. In terms of sustainability, risk and reliability remain front runners for us. You mentioned increased disruption around the world, and I think that's a big part of what we're focused on at BNY Mellon, given the external environment.
Great. Jonathan?
Yeah, thank you. Jonathan Atwood with Unilever North America, and been at Unilever 6 years. And thanks, Rich, for your comments and getting us started with that framework. If I just think about the last 6 years, I think the story at Unilever is, we have 180,000 employees. We're operating in 200 plus countries. We have 400 brands. I think the story for Unilever is a growing sense of the responsibility of the company given our impact on 2 billion consumers a day. And so that shows up in many, many different ways. So that's one thing, and we'll probably get into some detail around that. The second thing is, I would say, retail is changing quite a bit. The employee is changing a lot. What the investors are asking about is changing a lot. But I guess what I want to leave you with is, and I'll talk a lot about it, I hope, is this idea about it's not about us and them, it's about us. And we need to change the conversation and get more people into the conversation. Provide entryways for people to join the conversation, have something to say about what's going on in the world, and actually help to collaborate to actually make changes. One of the things I've seen, and even over like the last 5 years, is it used to be that the most trusted source was NGOs, and then maybe business, and then government was kind of fading, and then media is off the charts. And now for the first time we've seen kind of business now take a step into the leadership role just above NGOs, government fading, and media really far down. And we at Unilever, and I think obviously my colleagues as well, we believe that business now has to take a much bigger role in collaborating on the big solutions, on the systemic transformative changes that need to be, whether it's on climate, whether it's on hunger, whether it's the SDG kind of framework kinds of ideas, that it's companies getting together and having real conversations, oftentimes pre-competitively, about how do we change systems to make the required changes. And then the last thing I'll leave you with is, and hopefully we'll get into it, is that the idea that the changing employee is just amazing. Even in 6 years at Leaner, I've never seen this change of the new employee who shows up for the first day and what they want to talk about. And so a lot of my role in sustainability is I usually meet with every group of new incoming employees to have a conversation. I remember 6 years ago was me describing our sustainable living plan, 3 goals, 9 pillars, 50 time-bound targets. And now they want to talk about, what's your purpose? Okay, all right, slow down. What's the purpose of the company? What's your purpose? And then they start lining up the questions, and it's not necessarily related to one of the metrics in detail. It's about, is this the kind of company I want to work for? How am I going to fit in? What's my role? I'm in finance. Do I have a role? Oh yeah, you have a role across the board. So that's a really big change that I've noticed within our company, and certainly I've talked about with other colleagues at other companies. This changing demand or expectation of an employee is something I think we really need to look at and address.
And maybe before I move on to my next question, because Unilever, I think, is in perhaps a unique role in that you position yourselves as a company that attracts employees who are interested in sustainability. Are you guys noticing the same thing in terms of employee expectations?
Absolutely. There are now 4, in some companies 5 different generations in the workforce for the first time, which is something that we're grappling with along with a lot of other companies. But we're finding this set of expectations and quest for purpose really spanning the generations. Everybody wants to, expects more of their corporation in terms of it's not just a job and a place to work. It's a one life, and it's a part of your life, and an important one. And people want their values to align with the direction of the company, not just economically, but socially as well.
And I would absolutely agree. I think Pearson may be a little bit different or interesting in that a lot of people come to work for Pearson because they believe in education, they believe in the public education. A lot of them are teachers. So that sense of purpose has traditionally been felt in the mission of the company. And it's been an interesting journey. I've also been at Pearson 6 years. It's been an interesting sustainability journey for me because I came into the company with my drum saying sustainability, yay! And everyone said, but we have purpose, we have a mission, we do good things. And really kind of overcoming is not the right word, but working within a mindset that is we already do good to change that to, and here's how we can do even better, has been a bit of a journey for us. So we see purpose coming in, but then one of the things that we have to do for our employees is help them understand how sustainability can contribute to being even more additive to that purpose.
Great. So I'm looking at the sign here that says BBB start with trust, and Jonathan, you talked a lot about who do people trust, and the fact that across sort of every major institutional category, there's a vacuum of trust, and I do think we're in a really interesting point in time where business is actually coming in to fill that vacuum a little bit, and that people are looking to business in a way that they used to look to other institutions that have more of a formal role in the public good. There are pros and cons to having business sort of fill that void and start to be the place where the public trusts them. How do you think about that, and how do you think about the role of business in creating trust both with your employees, with your consumers, but society at large?
Yeah, our CEO, Paul Pullman, often talks about trust, and it comes in on foot and leaves on horseback, right? And it's really hard to build up, and it's really easy to lose. And I'm not suggesting for a second that we're perfect and that we get everything perfectly right. In fact, we make a lot of mistakes. But when you have a trust bank built up, oftentimes citizens, people, consumers will give you the benefit of the doubt, as long as you're being extremely transparent in the conversation. And so what we're seeing now is this this idea about disclosure, and we talk about these words, but the demand for disclosure, the demand for transparency, you can't go halfway and then stop and pull back. So what we're trying to do is create this environment where transparency and disclosure is out there. We're open sourcing most of the stuff that we do, we open source. So that when we come up with a recycling solution in Indonesia, we open source that so that other companies, including our competitors, can utilize that technology. Because we think that's the way to not only build trust, but to also create systemic change. So, you know, it's kind of a hard thing to talk about in terms of how do you do it. Am I worried that business is in this role? No, I'm not. I used to work in the government, and I think it's the only way forward because we can do things much faster.
Yeah.
We can find like-minded people that have interest in certain solutions. We can go out and find partners that fill different roles within, you know, virtual teams or coalitions, whether it's financial background or whether it's framework folks or metrics folks or, you know, local people. So I think we have agility, and I think that's the difference for business. But with it comes a major expectation that we deliver. And we all know that if we don't deliver, we'll be having a different conversation at next year's panel about how we failed.
Fair enough. I think one way that companies are starting to build their trust banks is through partnerships. Talking about trends, I think that the trend emerging towards enhanced public-private partnership will continue to grow. Just as an example from BNY Mellon, we've had a partnership with the UN Foundation for several years that began with advocacy for the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We've now that the goals have been adopted, we have moved into focusing particularly on SDG 5, advancement of gender equality. But I do think that I'm very hopeful that public companies companies and public entities like NGOs and civil society organizations can continue to enhance their collaboration to build trust amongst their constituencies.
Great, so we've got trust, we've got partnerships, what else drives, we've got transparency and we've got partnerships, what else drives trust?
I think the kind of buzz phrase in our community, the sustainability community, which is truer now than ever before and more needed than ever before, is stakeholder management or stakeholder engagement. You know, the online world allows us to directly engage with the communities that we work with and the people that we work with directly, and those communities have lots of different expectations. So we're under immense pressure now to really be transparent about a lot of different things at the same time. And I think it's important that companies are involved in that and live up to expectations. But that's really changing the way that companies think about engagement. On the flip side of that, I think on the stakeholder engagement piece, it's also important for companies to demonstrate that they can be part and are adding to something bigger than them. So back to the systems change piece, you see an increase in multi-stakeholder fora, you see an increase in collective action initiatives. And I think more than ever before, it's crucial for companies to get involved in these kinds of, in some cases, pre-competitive platforms and to demonstrate that they understand there's both a business reason and a societal reason for adding their voice, in some cases, to a particular issue or initiative. In others, it's really about working together in partnership on the ground to change. It might be it might be the business environment on the ground. Whatever it might be, I think there's increasingly a need for companies to do this more often.
Great. So just taking the concept of transparency a little bit further, and one of the issues that has not changed year over year is the increasing pressure on companies to be more and more transparent, as well as to respond to various questionnaires, surveys, indices, and report in various forum and on various issues. And so, Heidi and Amanda, maybe I'll start with you guys. What are those different levels of reporting and how do you deal with all of those sort of competing expectations?
I think at BNY Mellon, we've at least made a decision to pick and choose where we want to go.
Based on what?
It's a combination of elements. Really, where we want to be, where we want to be seen, what we value most. Resources are always an issue. I don't think there's anybody who can report to every index or rater that's out there. Another thing that we've introduced as well is, there's the heavy technical report, often GRI driven, that a lot of companies produce, but we find that to be not as accessible. Going to the stakeholder engagement point, different stakeholders absorb things differently and need different levels of information. And so alongside of our technical report, we now produce what we call a CSR overview, which is a much shorter 20-page document that tells our story, focuses on our strategy and global trends that impact our company and how we're responding to them. So I do think we're seeing kind of picking and choosing, a layering of reporting for various stakeholder audiences.
I would absolutely agree with that. I think the reporting is getting harder, actually, and not easier.
Yes.
It's really interesting because there's multiple initiatives, which you would know better than I would, Laura, about trying to bring some of these standards of reporting together, a little bit more closer together. We publish our GRI report. It isn't particularly accessible. I doubt that anyone reads it cover to cover, although it's wonderful. So I think what's more interesting, what was more interesting for us last year, for example, we published 3 new reports, sustainability-related reports, that were, 2 of which were a regulatory requirement, and 1 which was under pressure from NGOs. We are headquartered in the UK. Pearson's headquartered in the UK, so we are a UK-based company. We have to report on modern slavery now in our supply chains, which we issued our first report about last year. We have to report about gender pay, which was, the first report was last year. Actually, it came out this year in April about last year's data. And those were some interesting exercises for the company. But actually, I have to say, the fact that they were required by the government really has pushed a lot of new thinking and positive action inside the company. And it's opened up a lot of different conversations that I might not have been able to have with folks before. The third report that we published was a tax report, and that was under pressure by a UK-based NGO to be clearer and crisper in the disclosure of our tax practices and other companies' tax practices, particularly as an education company, given that so many taxes contribute to public education. But it's been interesting because those exercises are in and of themselves gigantic exercises of data collection and discussion internally and thinking through what we do, what we say, and what we don't say. And that's before we've even gotten to the sustainability report, which comes out in 2 weeks. And so it's been pretty interesting.
So I want to take a step back a little bit away from all of the specifics of the data and the reporting and transparency. And Jonathan, you touched on this before. You said you've been in your role for 6 years, and at the beginning it was around the strategy and the sustainable living plan and setting targets and processes to achieve those targets. And now it sounds like you're much more focused on purpose, which of course you need both. But the focus on purpose is not something I think we would have heard you talk about 6 years ago. I think you were really trying to be business relevant in terms of the strategy and maybe not talking as much about purpose. So tell us a little bit about that evolution and where you see that going.
Well, I think the evolution was, Paul Pullman arrived in 2009. The Unilever Sustainable Living Plan was created in 2010. As I mentioned, it had 3 big goals. At that point, it had 7 pillars, but now it has 9 pillars, 50 time-bound targets, which we report on every single year. So the framework was in place, and we were measuring a lot of things. I think the evolution now on purpose, and the company's purpose is to make sustainable living commonplace, i.e. available to everybody through our brands and some of the work that we do. What's interesting, in 2013 or so, we started to discover that the brands within our portfolio that had created an authentic purpose grew faster than the other brands in the portfolio. And so we started to do some work in this space, and we started to discover this in a much more deep way. So we have currently around 25 sustainable living brands is what we call them, which is a brand that has a clear purpose and delivers against an item within the sustainable living plan, i.e. it could be a plastic situation or it could be a climate thing. Those brands are 50% of our growth. They're growing faster than everything else in our portfolio. So what we're trying to do now is to build out these brands with purpose. Not all 400, that would take a while, but we'd like to get to the top 40, which make up about 80% or 70% of our whole business. And so what's happened now in this whole exercise, and if you think of Dove Self-Esteem or Dove with the Self-Esteem Project for the younger girls and self-confidence, or you think about Ben & Jerry's and social justice, these brands are growing faster than anything else in our portfolio. One. Two, the work and purpose has actually changed our marketing community, but our whole employee base. Because in order to come up with a brand purpose, you have to have the conversation about purpose. And you have to have the conversation about, is this authentic? So the brand purposes are usually found within the history of the brand. They're not created by an agency here in New York. It's not by somebody on the outside, typically, that comes in and says, this would be a cool purpose, why don't we do this? It's basically requiring the marketer to go deep into the history of the brand. Dove had been doing this for a long time, going way back. Ben & Jerry's was started in the 70s in social justice at a gas station in Burlington, Vermont. So where we get it wrong, if we get it wrong, will be when you all say, I don't get the connection between purpose and that brand. It's inauthentic, therefore it doesn't mean anything to me. And that's why we're taking our time to work it through. Vaseline Healing Project, Vaseline was created in 1880 around simply the healing of skin. And now they've taken that purpose into distressed areas around the world. And that's the purpose of the brand. It lights up the brand grows, and the employees, you can't even believe the marketing team on Vaseline that was one way about 4 years ago and now is acting in a completely different way because they stand for something bigger. They're part of something bigger. They're in Syria. They're going on these trips to do the real work with the doctors. And so, I would just say this. We talked about CSR in 2009. Paul Pullman arrived and closed the CSR department and said, that's not what we do here. So he closed the entire department and embedded all of us into the business. So sustainability at Unilever is the business model. I'm not at the end of the hall. I'm on the board. Sustainability is the business model. And so that's, because we believe that purpose without profit is CSR. And so we're right out in the open saying we're doing this because we want to grow our business, and at the same time we want to help the world and help consumers with whatever they need help with, and to change the dialogue and create great partnerships with others to create these transformative changes. But without profit, we're philanthropic, and that's not who we are as a company. We are a for-profit company trying to change the way people look at business behaves, etc.
Heidi, in many ways, and you referenced the SDGs. The SDGs was the world coming together to define our purpose, right? And to be able to say, if we think about, previously the MDGs had been very focused on the developing world. They've been very focused only on governments, and it left out sort of the rest of the world. Now we have this global vision around what we are all trying to achieve together. And individual functions, whether you're government or NGO or the private sector, can play your role towards that purpose. How has the SDGs changed how you think about these things at BNY Mellon, and how do you think it changes the function of sustainability?
Yeah, I think what was so remarkable about the new SDGs is that explicit call to the private sector and the tremendous funding gap that needs to be addressed in order for the world to achieve sustainable development by 2030 and not leave anyone behind. It really is that global, almost a risk map for the future. And as a financial services company that has a significant responsibility for our financial stability, we really saw the SDGs as a pretty significant evolution in terms of how the UN specifically, but the public sector and the private sector can communicate. And so we saw that. We reached out to the UN Foundation and said, hey, we want to support this. And so supported a number of convenings, really contributed to helping get the SDGs adopted. And now for the first time this year, we're actually trying to connect aspects of our business and demonstrate how those aspects of our business support the advancement of the SDGs. So we've done that in both our overview this year as well as in our technical CSR report. And I think we're going to see, I mean, we see other companies doing that, obviously, trying to connect their business today to advancement of various sustainable development goals that are most relevant to their business.
And do you use those words? So do you talk about the SDGs? Do you use the formal words with bankers internally, or do you try to embed it into the day-to-day language that they speak?
One example is that we recently held our senior leadership team meeting, and I was asked to talk about CSR to that group, and we talked about the SDGs and our commitment specifically to Goal 5, and in the sort of blog outcome from our CEO, he actually did talk about the SDGs and our support of the SDGs. So yes, we are seeking to embed it into the language of the company.
Great. Amanda, you've taken a little bit of a different approach. I think you've also done some of what we're describing here, but you've got a really interesting approach on social innovation and trying to create change in a somewhat different way. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you see that fitting with your overall sustainability efforts?
Sure, and I think it kind of ties back to the launch of the SDGs very early on. So I joined Pearson around the time that our current CEO was actually promoted to being CEO, and he was very engaged in the SDG conversation, as was I. I came from UNDP to join Pearson, and so we kind of went on an SDG journey together, which has been really interesting and helpful in terms of bringing him along as we go further into that agenda. And one of the things I think is really great about the SDGs is that it provides a kind of common language, a common agenda for the world that you can bring inside your organization and kind of get support for. And that's been a really great help in terms of bringing along the rest of the execs in the company on different parts of the agenda. The other thing that I think the SDGs have been particularly useful for in the context of Pearson has been on the innovation front, particularly on social innovation. So there's absolutely no question that we need to achieve the SDGs. I think we should not be thinking as companies that we're going to achieve all these great things without remaining consistent in terms of our approach to managing human rights risks, environmental risks, and other things. That maybe once you start thinking about the SDGs, kind of you get excited about that and you kind of want to stop doing all this other stuff or put all your resources over here. It's really important to keep doing this stuff. So we park that and we use the SDGs as what are we gonna do around the SDGs that's new and different while we maintain this part of what we're doing. And the way that we've worked that through is to look at social innovation and how Pearson can really start to think about serving markets that we're not serving today, particularly those who don't have, people who don't have access to education, people who are living in rural areas, who are low income, et cetera. How do we actually think about changing our business models to start to serve those types of communities in a profitable way? And so with the SDGs in mind, we started a number of programs to both internally and externally to do that. One of the most interesting, I think, has been something we call the Tomorrow's Markets Incubator, and we just ran our second round of that internally at Pearson, where we actually provide an internal fund, and we run a competition essentially each year where we ask our employees around the world for ideas of new products and services that can meet the needs of future generations and new markets that we're not reaching now. And last year we supported 17 teams to go through. This year we've changed things up a little bit. We're supporting 8 teams, but then we're going to give them more money as they start to go through product development phases. But essentially those teams have to demonstrate that they're creating business models that are both contributing to social need, but also clearly profitable and or have the potential to be profitable in the future. And we really have to manage the expectations of our executives around that. And that has been the journey, actually, in thinking that initially it was just a lovely thing to do on the side in support of the SDGs. As we ran the first round, we realized that our managing directors in regional operations were getting really excited about the business models. And they were getting excited about their potential to generate revenue. And then they were starting to say things like, 6 months from now, I want to see the revenue coming in through the door. And we're like, whoa, these are longer term models, think patient capital. So that's been a journey in terms of both managing expectations, but also getting the buy-in and support internally that we need to be able to make the contribution to the SDGs we want to make.
Excellent. So we've been talking a lot about process and how do you manage these issues internally and process. At the end of the day, we care about the issues and we care about driving change on fundamental issues. So how are you seeing the issues changing? Are you still working on the same issues you were 10 years ago? Are there new issues popping up? Are there some that are less important to you now? Whoever wants to start.
I'll start. I think some of the really powerful issues today, and this is maybe hearkening to my legal background and being part of a corporate governance team and being involved in the shareholder engagement and voting process, but I think you're seeing a lot on gender equality, gender diversity, and climate resilience, I would say, are in the forefront of stakeholders' minds today.
Data privacy is a big one for us, especially since we have a lot of student data, young children's data, and the whole artificial intelligence movement, if you could call it a movement, and how that's going to impact data, impact everything, really.
And why is that a CSR or sustainability issue? Can you explain?
Yeah, I think the way that AI will enable us to use and manipulate data in different ways has the potential, if we're not cautious, to be exclusionary, to actually create more exclusion rather than less. And so I think there is a movement to create data codes of ethics. My team's been part of a conversation, a beginning conversation, I will say, at Pearson around what that might look like for us. And people look to the sustainability function to know what is happening in this space, what are other companies doing, and often those companies aren't doing them particularly explicitly at this stage because it's still such a big kind of unknown domain.
I would say two things. One is kind of, we all know, supply chain risk, very, deforestation conversations around certain commodities, human rights related to that, employment issues, gender equality issues. The other big one is, I would say, plastics. And, we talk about the SDGs, and I haven't memorized all the numbers and how they all equate, but I go to that responsible consumption one, circular economy. Plastic seems to have come really on, it's caught on fire in the last, let's call it less than a year. National Geographic, we have Blue Planet 2 in London, based out of Europe. The conversation feels hot, and the responsibility on companies like mine that have a lot of plastic is big and clear. There is no place to kind of say, that's not our issue, we'll move on and let someone else manage that. So we've got to, now engage in ways that we've never engaged before, I think, or at least to kind of upgrade our engagement. So we're in conversations with, all comers, NGOs and governments and other businesses to try to solve what is a massive problem. And it's one of those stories that's very easy to communicate in terms of all you have to do is just watch the TV or look online and see the ocean plastic issue, which is a really, really big issue, but the bigger issue is how do we stop the flow into the ocean? But you see the pictures, they're very vivid, they're very graphic, and you get the point really quickly. So we as a company are in that conversation, obviously working very hard on it. It's going to take a really, really big effort by a whole bunch of actors to kind of solve that and move on.
Yeah, I was just going to add just one thing on the AI point, kind of in a different direction, but which probably impacts all of us, is this whole future of work debate that's happening and how companies are responding to that. And I think I'd actually be really interested in how the companies on this panel are responding. I think it's interesting, depending on where you're coming from, what industry you're part of, you might be responding differently. For Pearson, we're also, responsible for educating the next generation for a world of work. We don't know what it looks like. And so that's a really big concern for us, as much as educating our own workforce.
Yeah, I can't remember the statistic that I read about the number of jobs that will be available X number of years from now that don't exist today. As a really a digital or a technology company wrapped in a bank, that's very much on our minds. You know, how do you prepare the next generation to be skilled to meet the demands of the I guess, what would you call it, the fourth economy?
And vice versa, right?
Yeah.
And so the number of jobs that exist today that will not exist in the future. And I think that's a perfect example of what I was describing earlier around working on sustainability or corporate responsibility issues for where business is going rather than today. You know, and in supplier risk, for example, for the past 20 years, all of the focus has been on labor issues and how do you deal with labor issues and excessive working hours and safety issues. Technology can hypothetically solve a lot of those issues, but it's also going to put that labor out of work. And so how do you deal with some of those competing trends in a way that's going to think about where their economies are going in the future?
I was just thinking when I started in kind of this space a while ago, there was a very distinct group of the CSR group or the sustainability group, and then there was everybody else. And it feels like that line's completely gone. Every employee, whether they're first day or 25 years, believes actually they're in charge of sustainability at Unilever, which makes it somewhat complicated at times. Because they have this expectation, and I think it does tie to the future of work, because what we're getting a sense of is that the employee is demanding more, wants to be in a values-led company, wants to be working amongst brands that are actually making change that are positive, wants to be among colleagues that they feel like they're in the same game together. I think it's really interesting, what we do about that. We're offering, personal purpose workshops now to, it used to be for a more senior group of folks, we would go through these personal purpose workshops to discover our purpose and to work on it, and now we're offering it to every single employee. And, in the United States, 3,500 employees have been through, including factory workers, and we still have 7,000 to go. But it's automatically, in the last 9 months, it's dramatically changed the conversation in the company because people walk up to you and say, so what's your purpose? And why is your purpose that? And did you think about this? And, oh, my purpose is this. I think the future of work is something that looks at, all those things you guys have talked about, plus I think this changing dialogue amongst employees who will be demanding certain things, and if they don't get it, they're going to go someplace else. This market, as we all know, is hot. They don't need to hang around to wait 4 or 5 years for someone to get it. They'll just move on to someplace else and say, my friends are all over here, and it sounds really cool, and they're doing the right thing, so I'm going there.
Or they'll create it themselves.
Or they'll create it themselves. Or they'll join a couple people and start something up and do it all online. I think there's a level of urgency, certainly within our company, and I'm sure within other companies, about when you're in this space, there's a lot to do. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure to deliver.
Yes, you're right.
The employee proposition that's more than money, more than job security. They're asking questions about benefits. We've had to kind of completely modify our benefit package to deliver for the changing employee. We have Stork, which is the shipping of mother's milk to employees that travel all the time, and it goes on and on and on. All these things didn't exist a year ago or 2 years ago. And so it's this changing dialogue, which I think is healthy, but it's putting our company under a lot of pressure to deliver, not only to our employees, but to the folks who buy our products.
I think your point about the blurring lines is also, the pressure, we could probably all talk forever, and I see lots of nodding heads, and so I think you've hit on something. But I think also the point of the blurring lines is really interesting, because that means for those of you who actually have sustainability or corporate responsibility in your title, what is your role, right? So if you've integrated and everybody has to focus on it, and these issues are now all over the place, right? So it's not just as if it was easy, but just climate or just labor issues or just human rights. It's all over the place. It's every aspect of the business. What is the role or the function of somebody who actually has this in your title?
That is not an easy question to answer.
Really tough question.
I think it depends on the day. I use a football analogy. I would say that some days I'm a coach, some days I'm the general manager, Some days I'm on the field. Some days I'm in the crowd screaming. Right? I need this, that, and the other thing. But, I had this thing yesterday. A young person came in. I asked him, he said, could I get 15 minutes? Do you get a lot of that? Can I get 15 minutes just to talk about a few things? I'm like, oh, I know where this is going. He walks in and he says, I've been with the company 6 months. And I've just made a few observations, and I just wanted to bring them to your attention. And it relates to the plastic utensils in the cafeteria. I want to understand more about the composting program. And that community garden that's out back, how do I get involved in that? And this is just like in the space of 15 minutes. And it's like that conversation wasn't being had 3 years ago.
Yes.
And now all of a sudden and now folks are really watching. People want everything to match up, the rhetoric and the reality, or they want to help with the solution. So I don't know. Did you get my football analogy? The GM and the
good. I
coach
like
and
that.
I don't.
I do. I think you do play a lot of different roles, and I think a lot of them do connect to change agency.
Yeah.
And I think we talked a little bit as we were noodling about this panel was, is there a futurist aspect to the role? And when I think about SDGs, when I think about long-term goals, I think about leading leading versus lagging, and a lot of the things that like you were talking about 6 years ago, were kind of leading indicators are now embedded. And in a way, part of our job is to continually remind the company, hey, this is coming, this is coming, this is coming. And doesn't always fall upon receptive ears, but I think it's part of our job to speak up and keep those issues in the forefront for the long-term sustainability of the company.
I think that's right. I mean, so we published a report in January on redefining the role of sustainability management, and as part of that, we interviewed 50 people who are in your roles. I think some of you may have even been interviewed around how is their role changing, and the role of change agent was the number one thing that came out, because it's got to be your job to see plastics coming as an issue, because it seems to come out of nowhere for other people. And so you need to be engaging internally and externally, talking to a variety of different types of stakeholders, understanding what your peers are doing, and keeping the company ahead of societal issues in a way that is not anybody else's day job,
Right.
but then you're going to embed it in their day job once it becomes a material issue.
I think it can be, this is not a therapy session, but I think it can actually be a lonely kind of role. And I don't think most people would think that. But as the most senior person working specifically on sustainability in the organization, there isn't anyone else in the organization I can necessarily go to who will have the same depth of knowledge that even all of you will have on this, or all of my fellow panelists, or some of my peers. And so you really have to build a network externally of peers who you can go to for advice and support. And I think you have to accept that it is your job to point out the things that nobody wants to necessarily change, but are going to have to change, or they're going to be forced to change. And that makes you not always the most popular person in the room but you're invited into a lot of different conversations. And so you have to be able to overcome that weird dichotomy. And I related a lot to diplomacy, having an agenda, being able to build the relationships that enable you to achieve that agenda and bring people along and negotiate what it might look like and all of that.
Yeah, really interesting to me. And now I'm starting to it is a therapy session for me, so I'm enjoying it. Because I came from Vermont, and so for the first year I remember everybody said, there's the tree hugger. Everybody makes a value judgment. He's from Vermont, he's living on a farm, and now he's within Unilever, and he doesn't understand business. It's automatic that that a lot of the people I run into in sustainability, we're kind of seen as the non-business people. And I actually think that what we're experts in is human nature and human behavior and human relationships. And so what I also do, and I should have added onto my coach and general manager, was translator, because the issues are complicated. The acronyms, Rich, you talked about several acronyms. I talk about acronyms. We all talk about acronyms. And I'll be sitting in a room like this in Unilever, and people will be saying, "Oh, I get it. And then I walk out, and they said, "I didn't understand a word you said." Not one word. So it's, okay, so the SDGs, because we've had, interesting enough on the SDGs as an example, we've had more trouble probably embedding the understanding within the US context than in any of our other markets.
Yeah.
And maybe that's because of what the context that those folks are living in. It could be that. But it could also be that there's an overwhelming amount of information here or whatever. But so I'll try to break down, okay, if you don't understand what I just said, let me just tell you simply what it's about. Boom. If you forget everything else, this is what you need to remember. And that we're in these partnerships for a reason, and this is the objective that we're going for. Don't worry so much about the acronyms. So translator comes up a lot. And the other thing I would just say is, and I don't know if this is your experience, a lot of folks in big corporations don't spend a lot of time outside the building.
Yeah.
They do a lot of work behind their computer. They do a lot of work in meetings amongst the colleagues. They talk to each other, right? And a lot of that's reinforcing behavior. These jobs are very externally focused. Partnerships don't get created sitting in your office.
Absolutely.
Right? They don't.
Nope.
So you need to be out. I'll be on stage a lot, and I'll be challenged a lot about why aren't you doing this? Why are you doing it that way? What about this? Have you ever heard of this? I think that makes us better professionals, but that also makes us slightly different in terms of job skill from others who spend most of their time in a corporate setting, in kind of the womb of the corporation where things are safe. I don't really feel safe most days. I feel personally safe, but I don't feel safe like I've got it all figured out and I'm just going to tell you how it all works. Things are changing so fast.
Yeah, you're constantly rethinking your.
I'm constantly
positions and-
rethinking. Someone has a big thought, and I'll say, I'm going to take that back to the company. That's a big thought, or a different partnership, or a new framework that I need to look at and try to bring in. So
So I think that was a challenge to give us some hard questions.
no,
And there should be someone walking around with index cards, so we'll start taking those questions in just a moment. Maybe on that, and to continue our therapy session a little bit while we're waiting for some questions, what's the big challenge that is really limiting progress? So we've talked about all the things we need to do. What's been holding the field back?
I can take a stab at that. I think there's lots of challenges. I see every challenge as an opportunity. One of them is not every CEO is Paul Pullman. And that's fine. But we have to realize in our professions that having executive buy-in and that top-down piece can play a very critical role in achieving any number of parts of the sustainability agenda. And if you don't have that, driven by a kind of inner sense of purpose or by a complete understanding and appreciation of the agenda from top to bottom, then it becomes your job to help build that in. And that can be very difficult. And so how do you, in a world full of CEOs and large companies, I mean, is this notion of leadership on sustainability, is that nature or nurture? I think that's an interesting question and a challenge for professionals. Other challenges, I'm just trying to think of which one. I'm tired. I think the scope issue is a big issue, and I think we're going to come to a tipping point in our profession, and I hope it's after I've retired. I don't know what it will look like. Some of it has already started, where the whole notion of being a sustainability professional just may not even exist anymore.
Yep.
Unilever is pushing the agenda, and you mentioned this. Everyone's a sustainability professional. I think that poses a whole other set of challenges. So if it's not one group that's a sustainability group, and it's not everybody's a sustainability group, what the heck is it? And what is the right balance? And we may always be negotiating that, but until we have a clearer sense of that, I think we will always be, as professionals, renegotiating our roles internally on any number of issues at any given time. I get asked all the time, why are you getting involved in the tax report, which my team wrote, by the way, not the tax team. Why are you getting involved in the tax report? There's very good reasons for that, but if you ask, anybody on our exec, outside of the CFO, who knows very well why I was involved in it, they wouldn't understand why I'd have anything to say about that, and yet we spent quite a big part of our time last year working on it with them. that becomes mission creep after a while, and you're gonna have to choose your battles carefully.
Yeah, I think the mission creep question is a pretty significant one. Leadership, also significant. I think a lot about how long these roles will continue to exist. I think, I was reading a memo about expectations of boards the other day, and that it is the expectation that boards view sustainability not as a nice to do, but as a mainstream issue that they should be on top of as an element of long-term value creation. And while that's recognized, I think sometimes the gap between that understanding and how to get there is something that is partly our job to close, and it's step by step and bit by bit and person by person that you get there.
Just a quick comment. One is around business case. I think we're still having the conversation broadly about
Yeah.
the business case for doing all this.
Yeah.
We're kind of past that conversation, although it's still a daily it's still a daily fight. But this idea about, does sustainability grow your business, or is this a nice to do? I think we have to get over it. So I'm hoping that I'm out of a job because it's been so well embedded at Unilever that we don't need to have a separate group of folks that kind of watch over it, that it's just kind of there. Short-termism, I think, is a massive problem. Paul thankfully, told the investment community back in 2009 that we wouldn't do quarterly, guidance and earnings and all that. Hoping that I think others would follow. I think the conversation is now leading to that, where others will follow now.
I think is it Warren Buffett and Jamie Dimon who made the comment about quarterly guidance and suggesting that companies desist from that practice.
Yeah, and I get a lot of phone calls from folks who want to, never want to use their name, saying we're so with you, but we can't do it because our board would go crazy, our investors would go crazy, and they'd all leave. And then the third thing is, I just think we need to step up our courage and just stand up and step up and say, damn it, we've had enough. So I think the SDGs are really awesome, and that we need this blueprint for the world, but we need more people that are going to stand up and say, I've had enough. I'll buy from companies that do certain things. I'll associate myself and my work life with companies that I want to work for, that share my values, that are in the main game, that are not spectating, but are in the main game. They're fighting through things. They're making mistakes, but they're transparent. And we're going to be courageous, and we're going to take on the big issues. We have no interest. You have no interest in doing small, little, tiny things that don't matter. Right? We don't do anything that's of any magnitude by ourselves at Unilever. We always do it in collaboration because it requires a collaboration to get big things done. So I just throw it out there like, I'm kind of at the end of my career at this point, so I'm probably not like the 21-year-old that joins Unilever, where I'm not afraid if they say today's your last day, if I'm fighting for the right things. Quite honestly, I wouldn't have fought the way I'm fighting now when I was 21. But we now have 21-year-olds that are saying, I've joined the company, I've got a very short time here, make big things happen, or I'm leaving because there's lots of other options.
Yeah.
Lots of other options, and they're all over the place.
Excellent. Well, on that, I think we could go on forever, but you guys have stepped up to the challenge. So I've got lots of great questions. I'm going to start with the easiest one, which is, what is the hashtag for today? And that is hashtag BBD Forum. So in case you want to talk and tweet out about having more courage, we can get that mission going. There's a lot of nonprofits in the room, and so I got several questions around the role that nonprofit partnerships play. Can you provide some examples? Also, what are the criteria that you use to evaluate which nonprofits you might work with, so that they match your mission? So just talk a little bit about how you work with nonprofits, and Heidi, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure, I can talk about, I've mentioned the UN Foundation a couple of times, but in terms of seeking out partnerships, we look at a couple things. One is what our long-term goals are, and we strive to advance our long-term goals. So one example is, effective environmental management, and we have a partnership with the World Resources Institute to help develop a methodology for financial institutions to create science-based targets that are inclusive of Scope 3. So, you know, it's in our long-term goals. It's something we want to pursue, so we're making that contribution. With the UN Foundation, we, as a company, we are very focused on, as I said before, gender equality at all levels. And so once the SDGs had been adopted and we needed to go into the next phase of the partnership, we selected Sustainable Development Goal 5, gender equality, and produced 2 different reports. As a financial institution, we do a lot of research and analysis, so thought leadership is one way that we believe we can contribute. In collaboration with the UN Foundation, we produced a report called Return on Equality, which evaluates the market opportunities in 5 different sectors if women were to achieve gender parity with men. And then this spring, we launched Powering Potential, which takes a look at the financial services industry specifically and what the market opportunities there are for women to achieve gender parity. We discovered a $330 billion annual revenue opportunity if women had equal access to financial products and services as men. Again, really looking for partnerships that align with our strategic focus areas and where we can deliver tangible results and impact.
Great. Well, there's your business case. Amanda, maybe an example about more local partnerships, because I think you probably, you've got the big ones, but you've also got lots of smaller local ones.
Yeah, and I would agree with all of the things that Heidi pointed out about alignment, mission alignment, et cetera, and impact. We also look to engage with NGOs who are willing to engage with us in multiple different ways. I think gone are the days, at least for Pearson, we used to have a foundation, we don't anymore. We don't do grant making. We don't necessarily look to partner with an NGO and have a transaction, transactional, thank you. Transactional, I need another bagel. Transactional relationship. We want to learn from the NGO's experience, leverage their expertise on the ground in many cases. We have a partnership with Save the Children that we've had for the last 4 years, for example, that's very, very focused on the refugee situation and particularly refugee education on the ground in Jordan, where we do business. And 50% of the out-of-school population around the world are children affected by conflict. And so we're very concerned with migration and how that impacts the educational experience. And we started to work with Save the Children because we had an alignment of purpose. And we started to talk about what could we bring together to the table to really change for children on the ground in Jordan. And there were kind of 3 interventions that we talked about and that we've implemented. And the first was absolutely a donation to programs that Save the Children was running on the ground, particularly serving those outside of the education system, young children in particular. But we also started to do some joint advocacy with Save the Children, which resulted in the publishing of a report just last year around the time of the UN General Assembly called Promising Practices in Refugee Education, where we made a call for examples of different ways that different organizations were serving refugees who were displaced. And I think finally, and kind of the most exciting piece of that, is we are working together to actually develop a new product. So we've been working with Save the Children on the ground, actually going in with ethnographers into homes and talking to families about how their kids are using technology to access learning in the situations that they're in. We've been up on the Syrian border talking to families. We've been back in Amman talking to families. And as a result of that and continued engagement with the kids, actually we've developed a math game that kids can use to kind of keep engaged and interested in math during a time when classrooms are at 50 and 100 kids at a time. Many of them are falling behind. Many of the boys in particular are being asked to go out and work in the communities instead of going to school. And so we're trying to use this gaming technology and use the insights of Save the Children on the ground to build in some components to that game that keep kids interested and alive.
Great. So I got a number of questions as well around some different drivers. So we talked a lot about investor pressure and sort of public pressure, and then employee pressure and employee interest as some of the key drivers, but we haven't talked as much about consumers and regulation. And so the questions are around, is regulatory pressure a driver, and is that a good or bad thing? And then how much is driven by consumers? And if it is driven by consumers, how do you communicate to consumers on some of these issues? So given the consumer focus, Jonathan, why don't we start with you?
I was just thinking that I think the consumer interest is a bigger driver than the regulation, actually, in the US. I can't speak for other places as well, but the consumer, it goes back to the consumer expectation now. We make food, we make personal care. In food, they want to know where it came from. They want to know what every ingredient is. If they can't pronounce it, they don't buy it. So we're getting that direct feedback very openly and back and forth, and the demand is there and always there. In personal care, the conversations around chemicals. What's in my product? It's kind of the same thing, but in personal care, it's what's in my product. If I can't pronounce it, I don't want it. Why isn't it natural? And they have lots of choices. Lots and lots and lots of choices, and we need to deliver against that. So that is a big driver. So it's consumer education. We've created this thing with a bunch of other companies in the industry. It's called Smart Label. You can go into a store, you can get the app, you can then do the UPC code, scan the UPC code, and up comes the entire ingredient panel. Where do the ingredients come from? Does it have GMOs? Et cetera, et cetera. We'll build out even further depending on what inputs we're getting now from consumers about what other information do you want. Amazing to me, with no advertising, no marketing, something like 2 million consumers have been on to look at Unilever products. And that's just telling us, keep going, go faster, get more information, make it relevant, and tell the story in our words, in English, in very basic English, like what are we talking about? Don't overcomplicate things. Don't use the acronyms. Don't use the fancy words. This is where the product comes from. This is what's in it. This is our position on animal testing. Whatever it is, it's all right there for you as the consumer in the store. You just walk by, hit it, and then you get it. So we think this is really, how do you do that in an online environment? Gets a little more complicated, right? How would we do that at Amazon? That conversation's underway, but consumers want to know more, and they should. They have, they have that. We have the responsibility to deliver against that knowing more, but make sure that it's in a way that they understand what we're talking about. We're being very clear in our communication, and we're putting it all out there. Rather make a mistake putting more out there than come across as misleading, because it goes back to the beginning, which is it erodes trust.
Linda or Heidi, maybe you guys can touch on the regulatory side.
Sure. I think for us, regulatory pressure is still a huge driver, and part of that is just because of our business model. Pearson has traditionally and still does sell to government. So we sell to school districts, we sell to educational institutions, which are regulated in some cases, and so that's still a huge driver for us. I would say that the consumer piece is very quickly coming up the agenda thanks to technology. And an example of that is we get umpteen tweets a week from various people using our products around the world. Sometimes those people will put in snapshots of pages of textbooks or snapshots of screens where they've got a question on a particular subject and they find content offensive or inappropriate, and that's something that we never had to deal with before and are now getting it in abundance, and that has really sparked some change inside Pearson, change for the better, I think, where we've developed a whole set of editorial content guidelines that we're now centralizing and pushing out back through the company on how we deal with different issues. And those issues can be things like, what kind of pictures do we put in a textbook in the United States versus a textbook in Saudi Arabia? Or it could be, what are we teaching in this textbook, science textbook, about climate change? We just had an issue where an NYU professor published a textbook for us, or we published his textbook. It was put out for a test in another state, in a red state, and the textbook had a passage about the 2016 election and kind of characterized what people were saying about the 2016 election. And I can tell you we had a lot of very angry Trump voters that told us that we were indoctrinating people to be teaching people to be Democrats and all this kind of thing. So we've had to respond to both sets of pressures and
Yeah.
continue to.
Good. So I think the panelists will be happy to stay up here during the break in case you have other questions. So I'm going to close on a really practical question. And Jonathan, I'm going to give you a twofer since you asked for somebody to challenge you. So Jonathan, for you, the question is, 25, maybe up to 40 of your brands have purpose or seeing the most growth. What are you going to do with all the rest of the brands? And how do you make sure that they actually have purpose and impact? And then for everybody, the really practical question is, how do you personally stay up to date? So we talked about this role of the change agent. How do you know what the trends are, the news, benchmarking? How do you have that foresight for your company? So John, we'll start with you.
On the purpose question?
Both.
On the purpose question, all 400 brands are doing things, but when we talk about a brand with purpose, we're talking, this is a very in-depth construction, so not easily taken. So I just want to leave everybody, we're not dismissing the other 375. We're just saying at this point, 70% of the growth of the company is coming from sustainable living brands. A few come on each year. This is the wave of our company. This is the wave of the future for our company, and we'll continue down that path.
Great. And how do you stay up to date?
I stay up a lot. No,
Don't sleep. You
no.
heard it here.
You know, I use a varied kind of news. I do podcasts. I read a lot of magazines. I read a lot of books. I talk to a lot of people. This is not a job, as I said before. This is not a job where you sit in your office and study research reports and hope that great things come out of that. It's constantly being engaged in the community. It's in the sustainability community, if you will. It's being engaged kind of in just out in the world, seeing things and talking to people. That's
Great.
what I do.
Yeah, I don't think we're at a point where we have the journal of, XYZ CSR monthly publication that you can kind of count on to be it. So I'm an avid consumer of just about anything I can find on the internet about. I might look at CSR trends and pull articles that are of interest to me. We talked a lot about having a community of support, and that community is also a wonderful source for innovative ideas, new things that people have piloted or are considering. So I would say, my internet searches, my actually benchmarking of companies that are in our space, looking at them, and my community of support are the main ways that I keep up to speed.
I would echo all of that. I really find a lot of strength in the peer networks, as I mentioned. We're in one together. Heidi and I actually know each other from one of those, the Aspen Business and Society Leaders Forum. We're part of the BSR community of practice and various working groups. It's really important to go out. We have a lot of engagement and involvement and membership in multi-stakeholder groups, and so going out and meeting people in those groups and making personal connections so that when issues come up, you can connect with people bilaterally is hugely important. And listening a lot to what's going on in this space and to what questions people ask us when we go out and speak at these types of events is hugely important. I think that's what I would say.
I would add that, I find the community very generous.
Yes.
And so sometimes I'll have young people on my team saying, I'm in this conversation and I don't really know what to do next. And I said, have you thought about who's the expert in this space? And they'll name somebody. I said, did you write him a note? No, that person's like famous. I said, write him a note. You'll get a note back. That's been my experience, is that people are very, very generous with their time and their energy and their expertise. I had my own thing where I wrote Paul Hawken a note one day thinking, he'll never write back. He did. I had a question about Project Drawdown, his new thing, and he did. And I find that to be true almost all the time. Like, it's like, if you have a valid question or a question about something, reach out. People are generous.
Yeah, I would say that coming back to the theme of purpose, I think there is a sense of common purpose amongst the CSR, sustainability, ESG community, and you can really count on that to help you and instruct you, support you, and get you the information you need.
Great. Well, you can continue the conversations and start to build your own community of support over the break, and join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, Amanda, Heidi, Jonathan. That was a really great conversation. And now we are having a 15-minute break, and when we come back, Etsy's corporate responsibility journey, seen through the lens of technology and public policy. So we'll see you back here in 15 minutes.
They don't do long breaks here.